my God. Yeah, I mean, the diagrams are fascinating, and it's its own sort of nightmare discussion as far as I'm concerned. So if we get that far, I can just assume that's all we'll be talking about for the rest of the time. So we won't get any further, I suppose is how I would put it.
Fortunately, they're near the end. I think
This is
don't they
very
close
fortunate.
this.
Don't they what?
Isn't that the last? Is that the last paragraph or the?
It might be the last paragraph, actually. We may not get there today. We'll see. This is going to take as long as it takes. We'll make our way slowly through, and I guess I'll slowly kick us off so we can actually get to proper reading on Chapter 4, Section 1, because this is the Deleuze and Guattari Quarantine Collective's ongoing reading of Anti-Oedipus. Today we finally move into the Introduction of Schizoanalysis, the final chapter of the book, which, as I've been saying through most of this, we're slowly seeing more and more threads that began being weaved earlier in the book, coming together, layering in over and over and over. Why we spent so much time in Chapter 2 discussing psychoanalysis, why we've spent so much time in Chapter 3 discussing how semiotics operates and how our unconscious is produced through the very nature of communication and inscription and all of these things, starting to see how it all comes together. And that is, off we go. So, fuck it. Let's do this thing. As always, if you like what we're doing, you can support us on Patreon, whatever, DGQC. It's perfect right now. We actually don't need money. Every dollar helps us head towards our goal of being profit neutral, which is exactly what we are. We spend exactly the money that comes in, which is perfect. But let's see. Any other things? We're working on our Divagations conference. If you have anything that you want to contribute to the idea of wandering, which is the entire point of schizo, wandering, it's a better model than a neurotic on a couch. We intend to really break down what wandering actually means. If you want to help with that, we're in the Divagations channel here on our Discord. You can find us by Googling. For now, however, I'm going to go ahead and share and start reading out section 4.1, if you want to read along with me. Which comes first, the chicken or the egg? But also the father and the mother, or the child? Psychoanalysis acts as if it were the child. The father is sick only from his own childhood, but at the same time is forced to postulate a parental pre-existence. The child is sick only in relation to a father and mother. This is clearly evident in the primal position of the father of the horde. Oedipus itself would be nothing without the identifications of the parents with the children, and the fact cannot be hidden that everything begins in the mind of the father. Isn't that what you want? To kill me? To sleep with your mother? It is first of all a father's idea, thus Laius. It is the father who raises hell and who brandishes the law. The mother tends to be obliging. We mustn't make this into a scene. It's only a dream, a territoriality. Levi Strauss puts it very well. The initial theme of the key myth is the incest committed by the hero with the mother. Yet the idea that he is guilty seems to exist mainly in the mind of the father, who desires his son's death and schemes to bring it about. In the long run, it is the father who appears guilty, through having tried to avenge himself, and it is he who is killed. This curious indifference toward incest appears in other myths. End quote. Oedipus is first the idea of an adult paranoiac, before it is the childhood feeling of a neurotic. So it is that psychoanalysis has much difficulty extracting itself from an infinite regression. The father must have been a child, but was able to be a child only in relation to his father, who was himself a child, in relation to yet another father. Actually, a fairly crisp paragraph talking about one of the very underlying issues that they brought up very early on with the nature of Oedipus. The joke being that the father is ultimately really the one who starts this, if you want to really talk about it. But the blame actually gets visited on the child, who ultimately he was a child himself, and he was in this position of wanting to, kill his father and fuck his mother. That's why his father was actually a neurotic and an issue like that. But of course, he was also a child, and it just becomes infinite, sort of forever, this this quasi-cause of being the child that causes everything is very chicken and egg for the case of Oedipus. It's a really crisp paragraph. Please, if you have questions or thoughts on this, please open up.
I guess where to start, right? One of the things that interests me about this paragraph, and like you're saying, it looks like it's a very simple paragraph and it is very straightforward, right? Um, the interesting thing to me, though, is if you start walking out in terms of like disjunction on that, right? What I think there, or at least where we can start to understand this in terms of three syntheses, is there is, in fact, there's a really good line that I say earlier on, right? Society creates its own delirium by recording by recording desire and that something that effect. And I think that's where they're starting here. Um, so much so that this point about the child and about the child and the father, but the child and the parents too. You can see them calling to attention things like the zones, right? The Associus and the BWO. But also there's a problem of an exclusive disjunction at the filiative and the alliant level, right? The problem of father and son, or rather father or son, on the distribution of guilt, which we're getting into kind of a wonky chicken or the egg problem in that manner.
It's an easy opening. It's not as, I think, difficult as a lot of these or a lot of the other ones have been in the previous sections leading up to this, for sure. But I want to make sure that if anyone has questions, we get through it, because it's just on the edge of maybe you might have some things, which is fine. So if you have anything, don't hesitate. You can type it out in chat as well if you would like me to respond that way. But I can continue because we're about to move into what Jack was talking about, which is the delirium. So please, if you have something.
Yeah, I'll throw one more thing out there then. So there's the point that they make about the disjunct and the conjunct, right? So if we do have this problem of kind of the exclusive disjunction and the distribution of guilt, where they're pushing us into, I think, with this question of delirium is going to be that the way that affects the representation of subjectivity, right? That the distribution of guilt and the the consumption and consummation of guilt, so that's what it was, right? This is starting to come together as a form of delirium.
And as we discussed again in Oedipus at Last, the previous section, we're talking about the nature of how capitalism invests the entire social field within the family. The Oedipalization of all of this ultimately stems from capital pushing all this axiomatization to the parents, to the child, to the carving of things. They describe it multiple times, the 3+1, the corner folded, things like that. It's just wonderful imagery. But to continue, because here's where it starts getting fun. How does a delirium begin? Perhaps the cinema is able to capture the movement of madness precisely because it is not analytical and regressive, but explores a global field of coexistence. Witness a film by Nicholas Ray, supposedly representing the formation of a cortisone delirium. An overworked father, a high school teacher who works overtime for a radio taxi service and is being treated for heart trouble. He begins to rave about the educational system in general, the need to restore a pure race, the salvation of the social and moral order. Then he passes to religion, the timeliness of a return to the Bible, Abraham. But what, in fact, did Abraham do? Well, now, he killed or wanted to kill his son, and perhaps God's only error lies in having stayed his hand. But doesn't this man, the film's protagonist, have a son of his own? What the film shows so well, to the shame of psychiatrists, is that every delirium is first of all the investment of a field that is social, economic, political, cultural, racial, and racist, pedagogical, and religious. The delirious person applies a delirium to his family and his son that overreaches them on all sides. The investing of the social field, as we were just talking about, as Jack was just mentioning, this idea of the Oedipus, the paranoiac of the parent. He mentions Laius in the previous paragraph, who raises hell and murders or goes out and kills, does all these things. The father raises hell, the mother being there. The core element behind all of this at the base layer is the delirium, and the delirium begins first by being invested socially. It's the first thing desire does is it invests within that sort of space and how these things sort of get formed. Um, the way that the codes move within the space uh, pushes towards that. The social delirium of all of that. I love it. Um, they did misspell Nicholas Ray. There is a H in there. It's fine. It might be the OCR. Also, it's hard to know if they necessarily did fuck that up. But his old films, Nicholas Ray did a ton of stuff. They Live the Night did Rebel Without a Cause, which is, I think, going to be coming up and having that conversation. I think we're even talking about that now. Johnny Guitar, like this, the nature of sort of that sub working class character or heroes that really came out during that era, he shaped. And they're very much talking about this here. The way that the father, angry, wants to restore his race, wants to get back to the way things are, wants to get back to Abraham ultimately, all of these things, these investments of his desires. It's a delirium first. It's a great set of lines and references.
I think that it just indicated that it's a multi-generational conflict, that the father is sick because of the way things were as well, right? So
No,
I don't know.
that's actually the point they're making is the opposite, that there is an infinite regression if we go down that road, that uh, oh, the child is Oedipalized because the father, the neurotic, puts him in the position. Well, he does that because his father. But this is not this infinite regression doesn't really have an end, because it gets to the position of the chicken and the egg. Which came first, the child who wanted to kill the father, or the father spited by his son? It's not really how things work, through this sort of weird genetic assumption that both sort of came about together. Very often, and they talk about this earlier, psychoanalysis actually puts the child as the originator of where the Oedipus complex comes from. That it's the child's fault, which is on its face almost patently humorous, especially how they break it down. Is the child doesn't have connections. They're formed by the social strata that the parents lay in front of them. And so to blame the child is incredible. But then if that's the case, then we blame the child when the father was a child too. So it's the father's fault equally. And that's to them sort of an absurdity. They're very much pushing, instead, saying the social stratas that we deal with, the social fields that are immediately there, social, economic, political, cultural, racial, pedagogical, religious. This is actually where a delirious person first applies the delirium to his family and his son, that overreaches them on all sides. The father, the mother, the whatever you might be, who's raising the child, you're taking in the social order of things and applying those rules to the child. You're applying those rules to the family, and these rules overreach us in every single direction. They start first, though, with the delirium of the investment in the social field.
Well, does the Abraham story, mean that it is a kind of it originates in the mythology, the despotic mythology of of this religious belief in this the God, the transcendent God that is the father figure that maybe is the beginning of that.
Maybe.
Well, I
Well,
I don't
go ahead, Jack.
I think you got to look at it in terms of a social problem, not a religious one per se, right? I
Mhm.
don't think it's that God per se, although it's worth understanding the conditions for such a thing, right? Because this could be, and they point this out, it can apply to any religion because of its social context. And that conditionality, like you're saying, would be the despotic. But in doing so, right, um, that's a condition for such problems to eventually materialize. With capital, one of the interesting things going on here, right, is that you get the familial, because right, we're in a different socius here. You get the familial kind of in simulation of the economical. right? And that's because capital takes over the second synthesis, right? You get the filiative and the alliant through forms of capital, the D of X over D of Y problem, right? And as you're going through that, that means that actual filiation, actual alliance, right, are happening in terms of basically cash, and things are produced in that way. But the familial simulates that. And this is the point they're starting to drive into, that any holy family of God, right, especially in this circumstance, is simulating that exclusive disjunction at the economical level. And in doing so, right, the subjectivity of the familial is part of that conjunct, is part of the disjunct um, of that economical aspect, which is a long way to say that the social is going to condition the familial because they're coextensive, since one is a simulation of the other, right? The familial is a simulation of the economical here, and ultimately the second synthesis. So in doing so, right, it's not, and this is to return to the original point, we want to be careful to understand a religious investment as a social, from a standpoint of the social, so as not to say that this is like to not do the thing where we just say like this is religion getting in the way. This is the way that which conditions any religion, right, is producing these matters altogether that will then go on to construct any religion.
I
Well,
would add, just real quick, because I have a slightly different take that I think might be, maybe it's an oversimplification, but the phrasing here around Abraham specifically, because there's a little bit of a rant about Abraham in, I'm 99% sure we're talking about Rebel Without a Cause here. I haven't watched it in too long. The rant about Abraham specifically is, I think, brought in here as a wry joke because it's literally the opposite of the Oedipus complex. Um, the idea being that he's going back and calling back to what Abraham did. Well, what did Abraham do? Well, he wanted to kill his son. Perhaps the only error lies in having stayed his hand, but doesn't this protagonist have a son of his own? So it's that his fantasy, his delirium is almost about the literal opposite of, instead of killing your father and fucking your mother, it's killing your son. His desires, his drives, these things are in opposition to what seems to be a determinate reality in the nature of the father-son relationship. And that's kind of the joke here, that these investments are social, these investments are around us, and they are ultimately causing these deliriums that are invested contingently around them rather than these weird, large, transcendent concepts.
I'm not sure if it is the opposite, because in Oedipus, the father also wants to kill the son, but the killing of the father is justified through the guilt of the father wanting to kill his son. Right?
Right, but that's the line they have here. But maybe God's only error was having stayed his hand. That's what Oedipus did. Oedipus stayed his hand. Like, again, this is a reference towards like that kind of thing, playing towards this about the protagonist ultimately wanting to kill his son, wishing he could kill his son. It feels like it's intentionally done there. That's, again, going back, these things are investments that are social. He wants to go through these processes. He wants to go through this. How I read it is that that's the primary, if there's a cause, the primary cause is the social field that is causing these investments in the deliriums that inform them.
Yeah. Well,
do
in
you
the
think that?
yeah, go ahead.
I just think that in a social context, it'd be important to take a look at that. It's kind of an evolving socius, and so what the psychologists of the late 1900s were considering, there may have been like social uh, constructs, social disparities between generations that are less prevalent in today's era. So, I mean, maybe when we're looking at this, particularly in relationships with the family, um, that they may be right about generational conflict, but I don't think that it can be necessarily be carried straight up to the point of uh, like modern era. I don't think. I think it's kind of, we're almost looking, like kind of looking at a classical, like a historical Socius there also.
Well, to comment, so first of all, I like where you guys are taking that. I mean, Brooks, that's an excellent observation about the father and the son, right? And that is like the whole first paragraph. I think I think the thing they're doing there to play on that is right. So I mean, that is the Oedipus story, right? Is Laius will try to kill Oedipus so that Oedipus doesn't grow up to kill him. But obviously that doesn't work out because the servant supplants the yeah the I don't want to say the robbing of the child, but the servant prevents Oedipus from being killed. Like you're saying, it's actually very similar to Abraham's hand being stayed by God, except that it's stayed by just a lowly servant at the court. Um, but I think the thing that happens there then is right. So what's going on? It's that psychoanalysis has a presupposition um, that they kind of talk about, but that they also marginalize, right? This is sort of the unconscious of psychoanalysis is everything they're putting on the father in order to start with the child. And by doing so, because you get the 3+1 all at once, it doesn't come in, it's not like you have a child and then you go on, right? You get the family all at once, especially because it's a simulation. Um, in doing so, right? So not only is that a marginality to psychoanalysis, but it's one that actually is doing a lot of stuff because of the social investments, like you're saying. And those social investments are playing out, in this case, through yeah, they don't name the character, but through Nicholas Ray's film.
We're asked, it's worth mentioning here too, because we're getting into, and the word delirium is going to be thrown around a shitload. And it has been already, but this is where it's going to be really significant. The use of delirium here is unique because it's specifically being translated from the original French, where they also use the term délire, which means hallucination. The meaning of delirium in this context is not a thing that I think people have settled heavily on. It's not a fun one. But so because Normatic is asking what is understood by delirious in the context of cognitive science. Is delirious for the child needed to form a mental structure to grasp concepts? We're talking about the hallucination that the father has, that there is a pure race, that we need to get back to the larger stories of representation. I would almost equate it to, I know a few of you are in our Logic Sense group, feels like Phantasm a little bit to me as we've been getting deeper into what a phantasm is and how it plays. The story that links things that doesn't have its own origination, that doesn't connect to anything. The deliriums here that are invested, every delirium is this story told within the social field that is finding ways that these elements are connected and telling the story between them that really isn't a thing. It's a thing, but it's not like real. It's a hallucination. It's a delirium. It's not necessarily a negative thing either to Deleuze and Guattari. It's not about us getting away from deliriums and seeing the world for what it is or some nonsense. There's great power in deliriums. They even greatly talk about this actually a few times. So there's a lot of really interesting sort of ways that it's used, but I wanted to see if anyone wanted to expand on that because the concept of delirium is itself difficult.
It's the interview I usually read, but because there's this great piece that I think is actually called "What is Delirium?" that they did for Samuel Test. But yeah, I think the thing we can say right now is it's not delirium in the typical use, right? That someone is like um, somewhere between hallucination and the non-hallucinatory, right, reality.
Mhm.
Like you're saying, I think it is probably more in between the tension of the unconscious producing things syllogistically, and then the representation and the paralogisms of that, right? Between the basically between the BWO and the socius, right?
Mhm.
Especially when you start walking in, and we'll do this as we go, right? To break down and to break through the the filiative and alliant through capital, right? That those kind of disjunctions and the subjectivity that comes with them, right? Just like we're seeing here, right? Where the economical aspect of working at working as a high school teacher in a radio taxi service, right? That economical aspect, that social aspect, coming with the subjectivity of a guilt, right? And the kind of debt that comes with that guilt. And also the way that that's, and a typical psychoanalytic would be to say that this is a projection onto the family, but it's a simulation actually of that guilt and everything at the familial level.
Can I jump in real quick?
Please, please.
Yeah, that was it for
Um,
me.
yeah, I kind of had the same question for the past couple sections, but going into kind of this area, I started to get reminded of earlier when they would talk about global persons, like molar aggregates, and like with the global person, it's like you start with the self-contained idea, like this is what like a woman is, and this is how they act. Or this is how the child is. They wants to kill the father and have sex with the mother, so that's how he'll act. And if the paranoid father thinks of his child as that kind of global person, and of course he's going to develop that kind of anxiety. And the same thing is said, what really like ticked it off for me is when they was talking about the education system in general. um, it's that same kind of like application or paralogism, as they say, that's at work. Is the paranoid father is not actually like concerned or invested into like a specific thing that's happening with the education system. It's just these kind of attributes he's kind of applying to it in abstract, and it's bad, and we need to return to a higher unity that's closer to the self-contained ideal. And that's why I included that article too, because it's just really coincidental. The guy highlights it. I don't even think he's ever read Deleuze or Guattari, but he talks about how people at like the turn of the 18th century were concerned about Illuminati coming to America with anti-Christian values that would destroy the Christian way of life and all these things. And the same thing with the New Deal in the 30s, that it was going to destroy like whatever kind of way of life, and not any particularity of it, just kind of the whole thing.
Well, it's a first one that comes to mind for me is critical race theory.
Yeah, that's a good one.
It's those kinds of things, these odd moments where they're not even about the thing. Because if you sit and you talk with people, you go, hey, so what exactly is it? Not only can they not say, because they're not actually concerned really with what kids are being taught. They're concerned of the idea of the thing. The delirium and the nature of it is kind of plays towards that. It's a really good way to put it, Taryn. Thank you. I like that. It's a fun again, it comes down to, and they talk about this, they even have a big piece they did called Capitalism, a Very Special Delirium. There's natures around us and deliriums around us that we're all taking part in. The idea that there are laws is one. There aren't. That is silliness. There's silliness there. But as some that we just kind of accept, it's the nature of sort of social axiomatics, is that there's this delirium that comes with them, that we just believe in the law, or we believe in these things. I really like the way you put it, though, Tiernan. That's nice. I'm going to probably clip that later. It's a good one. Joseph Gable, presenting a case of a paranoiac delirium with a strong polito-erotic content, replete with suggestions for social reform, believes it possible to say that such a case is rare, and that, moreover, its origins are not reconstructible. Yet, it is evident that there is never a delirium that does not possess this characteristic to a high degree, that is not originally economic, political, and so forth, before being crushed in the psychiatric and psychoanalytic treadmill. Judge Schreber would not deny this, nor his father, who invented the pangmasticon and a general pedagogical system. Google that. Have fun. That's the worst thing to have in your search history. Everything changes, then. The infinite regression forced us to postulate a primacy of the father, but an always relative and hypothetical primacy that carried us to infinity, barring a shift into the position of an absolutely primary father. But it is clear that the viewpoint of regression is the result of abstraction. When we say the father is first in relation to the child, this proposition, devoid of meaning in itself, concretely means the following. The social investments are first in relation to the familial investments, which result solely from the application or the reduction of the social investments. To say that the father is first in relation to the child really amounts to saying that the investment of desire is, in the first instance, the investment of a social field into which the father and the child are plunged, simultaneously immersed. Fucking really clear last bit of lines. Judge Schreber's father was a horrifying human being. If you want to Google what not to do to your children, he's great at that. He built straps that kept him like upright in very specific orders. It's awful. It was gross. It's gross. Dude's gross. But the point is that Judge Schreber would not deny his father was a pile of shit, but also that his father was originally sort of set up and then crushed into this psychoanalytic theory of here's how we need to form people, here's how we need to build it. Very much Judge Schreber actually kind of talked about this inside of the pieces you're able to read on it. The thing is, we need to step back and we need to go, wait, we have the father and the child who are immersed simultaneously into the social field around them, where they happen to live, what the culture is around them, what the political stances are, the race, all of these things. It's not so much that the father visits them on the child or the child visits wherever he sits on the father, but that they simultaneously are placed into the social field, and this investment happens pretty much imminently and constantly. That's how I read the paragraph. Please, I'm open up for questions or commentary. Okay. Well, that's excellent. It's a fairly crisp paragraph, I think. So I'm going to assume there's no major questions or comments, and we can keep going. Hey, take your time. I'm happy to let you think, Tiernan. The thing I do like is they open with Gable in his story of the one patient who, isn't it strange? He has this idea of how we might change things. That's so silly. No one is like this. And their argument is actually they all are. You just aren't seeing it because the first thing you do is you crush it into the triangulation of mommy, daddy, me. And again, fold the tablecloth, as they refer to it a few times. That's the nature of the couch and the psychoanalytic condition. That last line, though, to say that the father is first in relation to a child really amounts to saying that the investment of desire is in the first instance the investment of a social field into which the father and child are plunged, simultaneously immersed. I will continue. Let us again consider the examples of the Marquesans as analyzed by Cardner. He distinguishes between an adult alimentary anxiety linked to an endemic famine and an infantile alimentary anxiety linked to a deficiency of maternal care. Not only is it impossible to derive the first anxiety from the second, but one cannot even consider, as Cardner does, that the social investment corresponding to the first anxiety comes after the infantile familial investment of the second. For a determination of the social field is already invested in the second type of anxiety, namely, the rarity of women that explains how it is that adults, no less than children, are wary of them. In brief, what the child invests through the infantile experience, the mother's breast, and the family structure is already a state of the breaks and the flows of the social field in its entirety. Flows of women and of food, recordings and distributions. Never is the adult an afterword of the child, but in the family both relate to the determinations of the field in which the family and they are simultaneously immersed.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I really like about it is so this line, not only is it impossible to derive the first anxiety from the second, but one cannot even consider, as Gardner does, that the social investment corresponding to the first anxiety comes after the infantile familial investment of the second. For determination of the social field is already invested in the second type of anxiety, namely the rarity of women that explains how it is that adults, no less than children, are, quote, wary of them. Sorry, the thing I like about that is that, it's a nice case in point what we were just talking about, that with the social investment, there is also going to be this kind of secondary familial investment, right? But when we're dealing with people in relation to each other, it's not as though, and this is the chicken or the egg thing again, it's not as though one father passes it on to one child, passes it on to, their child, passes on to their child, right? That in all these different cases, these people have already been invested with through desire, right? This production of the real is already taking place so as to produce them. And in that manner, then, you're going to find these different investments playing out in these people, right? Not in such a way that it's a projection per se, but in such a way that um, this is how they've been produced, right? Not as necessarily father or son, but through these different connections of desires, distributions of them, and subjectivities that they ultimately consummate, that they are ultimately consummated by.
Quick question, maybe naive, but the first anxiety and second anxiety, that's just like the event that happened in someone's childhood that like follows them or whatever. Does that
So
make sense?
this one's unique. The Marquesans aren't like a family. It's not Mr. and Mrs. Marquesan. It's the Marquesan people that they were actually going in and having this sort of writing and reading about and discussing. Specifically here, God, this has been a while since I've read, so I apologize if I'm getting any of this wrong. I'm trying to go top level. The way that they had their sort of society set up is there was overall a lack of women because there was a whole bunch of reasons for this, but children kind of grew up without consistent food as a thing. And later on, when there were famines, people generally had insane anxiety about a possibility of a famine. Cardner, as he does here, they say the first anxiety somehow comes after. So the fear of the anxiety of famine comes after the infantile investment of the second. To them, the way that they're saying, in brief, what the child invests through the infantile experience, the mother's breast, the familial structure, is already a state of breaks and flows of the social field in its entirety. There really isn't even a second, almost, that they're saying here. Never is the adult an afterward of the child, but in family both relate to the determinations of the field in which both the family and they are simultaneously immersed. The nature of having a lack of women is a famine in and of itself. These are the same thing. There is a political determination. It's not just my lack as a child of having mother around or being fed, but instead the larger social realities that everyone is sort of subsumed through. It's happening to the child and the parent. It's not that there's a second anxiety, is how I read this. But it's a tough paragraph to kind of break that down. I'd love to have if anyone else sets that up. The Marquesan thing was fascinating because it was, the reason there weren't a lot of women is war had happened, and that's when Cardner came in. And so the lack of women and the problems that were happening later then visited as a fear of famine, he saw as, oh, they didn't have that. It's like, no, we're talking about a larger political and social political reality. It's not just that the baby didn't have food and then that sort of registered as, oh, no food, but that there is, as a family and as a group, the people who are taking care. The lack of women was due to a fucking war. I'm pretty sure. Goddamn, I need to Google this before I say anything more. Give me a minute. If someone wants to talk, I should Google that before I say anything more.
So he's saying that there is this what is this anxiety linked to the famine, endemic famine, but it's in a context of an anxiety, of a social anxiety that was already established, right?
The desire, and for even everyone, the first place desire invests itself is the social. That's where we're at.
Right.
And so there we go. Thank you very much, Sinclair. Jesus. So if that's the case, the idea of breaking down is, oh, it's mother breast, and that's no. There's a social stratum that actually is sort of visited on everyone simultaneously. It's not just that, oh, the father has a more developed this, but it's because when he was younger he had this. It's like everything kind of visits us as part of this social investment, this larger social field that plays through all of these things. because it's the point they make here. I think they're saying it straight, because it's hard to tell when they're being sarcastic sometimes. For a determination of the social field is already invested in the second type of anxiety, namely the rarity of women, that explains how it is that the adults, no less than the children, are wary of them, which is this very specific line that Gardner sort of attached to. But again, the issue is, as they say, they don't have food and they have an endemic famine that's consistent. And there's this like issue that babies aren't getting enough food. This infantile alimentary anxiety linked to a deficiency of maternal care. Boy, that's said overly complicated. They have ongoing hunger, and then also the infants aren't getting enough food because just in general, there aren't enough women. Everyone's trying to do stuff. War has happened. Illness has happened. They're having a lot of death. So socially, it's all being visited at once. Logan on our YouTube says, I can't tell if Deleuzian's Googling is tenderly ironic or it's right on brand. Also unable to figure out whether or not tender irony is quintessentially Deleuzian or Guattarian. I don't even know what that means. We're Googling to understand what references are. That's what we do. Jean-Claire says, it's like collective generational trauma passed down. It's and experienced eminently by parent and child. As a social investment, I think, is what this is talking about here. The familial structure is already in a state of breaks and flows of the social field in its entirety, flows of women and of food, recordings, distributions. Never is the adult an afterword, but the family both relate to determinations as they are simultaneously immersed.
Yeah, I think you got it there, right? It's not, I don't think it's the passing down in that, it's that in the social context, right? The way that everything's being produced, right? There aren't, the idea of weaning on that isn't a scarcity too. And there's a repetition that comes with that, right? So it's not so much like this is something that the child is going to carry going forward, that they had a problem with their mother growing up or what have you. It's that these acts of feeding on that, right, existing through a social investment, such that the child would be doing these weaning acts, right? Oops, you still hear me? Yep, sorry about that.
Yeah.
Didn't move my mouse for a while. So in the repetition of those acts, right, there's a recording that happens and a distribution, and there are subjectivities produced through that, right? And that is what that's what we're seeing here, is that ontology of it, as opposed to the passing down of a generational issue with women, right?
Yes. Well, and again, I think all of this is ultimately coming back to the same thing that it started with, that they've been talking about in the irony they brought up early in chapter 2 and mentioned in 1, which is the idea that it starts with the child, which is very much what Oedipus is about as a complex, that it requires all three. This is the comment of the chicken and the egg. The idea that it starts with the child is silly, but here's how they're explaining it, and here's how they're kind of getting through that.
Kind of like the every child is an orphan kind of thing, they say.
Yes. It puts us in a different spot where it's, I mean, we'll get into it in the next one, but it's understanding that, again, our investments come through the social, our investments come through these other things first, rather than, oh, it's this determinant thing of how the family interrelates to itself. Maybe there's other stuff outside of the family, perhaps, like an entire fucking world that's continually putting pressure on it and placing us in different, anxieties and stratum. Just a crazy idea that there's a whole world outside of the family. Logan is asking an excellent question. I'll stick around to the end. We'll bring it up. We're going to try to get through some more text. I'm going to continue the next paragraph, and we'll continue through, though. Hence, we are confronted by 3 unavoidable conclusions. 1, from the point of view of regression, whose meaning is only hypothetical. It is the father who is first in relation to the child. The paranoiac father Oedipalizes the son. Guilt is an idea projected by the father before it is an inner feeling experienced by the son. The first error of psychoanalysis is in acting as if things began with the child. This leads psychoanalysis to develop an absurd theory of fantasy, in terms of which the father, the mother, and their real actions and passions must first be understood as fantasies of the child, the Freudian abandonment of the theme of seduction. 2. If regression, taken in an absolute sense, reveals itself to be inadequate, it is because this regression encloses us in simple reproduction or generation. Furthermore, taking organic bodies and organized persons as its object, the theory of regression merely attains the object of reproduction. The point of view of the cycle alone is categorical and absolute because it attains production as the subject of reproduction, which is to say, it attains the process of autoproduction of the unconscious, a unity of history and of nature, from homo natura to homo historia. It is certainly not sexuality that is in the service of generation, but progressive or regressive generation that is in the service of sexuality, as a cyclical movement by which the unconscious, always remaining a subject, reproduces itself. There is then no longer any call for wondering which is first, the father or the child, because such a question can be raised only within the framework of familialism. The father is first in relation to the child, but only because what is first is the social investment in relation to the familial investment, the investment of the social field in which the father, the child, and the family as a subaggregate are at one and the same time immersed. The primacy of the social field as the terminus of the investment of desire defines the cycle and the states through which a subject passes. The second era of psychoanalysis, made just as it was completing the separation of sexuality from reproduction, lies in having remained captive to an unrepentant familialism that condemned it to evolve solely within the movement of regression or progression. Even the psychoanalytic conception of repetition remains captive to such a movement. Let's take the conclusions and break them out. There's 2 so far. We haven't gotten to the third. The first element that is important that we need to deal with is the fact that it is the father that comes first to the child. The father Oedipalizes the son. I think that makes more sense than having a baby do things to a parent. Sure, but they outline sort of why. We need to forget that things begin with the child. We need to instead change how fantasy is built and change the terms of which those things matter. Their real actions and passions must first be understood as fantasies of the child. No, we're tossing that aside. The parents are the parents. This is the second. If regression taken in an absolute sense reveals itself to be inadequate, it's because this regression encloses us in the reproduction or generation. This is because, and to say it short here, it requires the family. The family starts here. This is the thing. The point of view attains production as a subject of reproduction. It attains the process of autoproduction of the unconscious. This is because this is the family first. The father is first, but only because what is first is the social relation in relation to the familial investment. How do you tell a child to be successful? Well, the father has to. The mother, sure, a parent. The parent has to do that. Now, why do they say certain things, or how do they do that? Oh, the social field. This is the thing I think that makes more sense to all of us. It's not that a parent divines on their own what success of a child looks like, or the right college to go to, or the right elementary school, or how to stand, or how to talk, or how to say please and thank you. These are things that are not the child visiting that upon the parent, or why to say these things. This is the society at large and the social field as a investment of the parents being visited on by the whole family imminently at once. This is the grouping of it. Jean Claire, I'm going to make sure we star that because that's just a great pulling out. Doop, doop, doop. Any questions? Any comments here? I know it's a little bit much to sort of read through. The third bit, which is what Jack has been getting at, which is the disjunctive, is coming up in the next paragraph. But these are essentially the two things. It's a first understanding that No, it's the father that comes first. But the reason that the father comes first is it's because of the social field that is impinging upon the family as a whole, and that the family is a form to the setup.
I mean, they're already getting at it with this idea, with the point that guilt is an idea projected by the father before it is the inner feeling experienced by the son, right? Um, I think part of what you can draw from that, or at least what I draw from that, um, it goes all the way back to the first socius, right? The use of guilt in the theater of cruelty, the use of guilt in the distribution, the distributive synthesis, right? The filiative and the alliant, and the use of debt, or particularly then the debit system as opposed to crediting in the second socius. So I think you're getting that carry on um, right here as well. And like you're saying with the second, the one of the things that I attach to there is, it's funny, you could almost contrast this with the eternal return and that, but um, one of the things that I take out of this point about the cycle there is, right, and this is something I think we've seen a lot of the ways we think about things, right? We take a process and we take it in terms of something regressive or progressive, right? And it doesn't really, it appears to us as though it's self-produced, right? Um, and that's kind of the thing that we're circumventing here, is that uh, instead of seeing the process in its self-production, which would be the unconscious, right? I think what they're getting at is we're basically taking the organization of something, we're taking something that's appeared to us, and we're making that uh, the explanative means for what came before or what comes after, right? That we're going to keep finding it in this configuration, and we're not able to really explain how it's been produced, right? We're going to keep finding the father and the son, but we can't really, we can talk about how it passes on generations, and we can talk about how it precedes generations, but that doesn't really get at the production of that, right? What made all of that possible? How did it happen? Instead we're just going to go backtrack or forward track and basically repeat ourselves. But that's not auto production. That's not the unconscious. But
And
it
it's the
looks
auto
like
production of the
that's
unconscious is absolutely a key phrasing there. Unity of history and from homo natura to homo historia it's a great
say,
line.
like sexuality
Any
stands in the surface of generation, right? Generation and regeneration are in the service of sexuality. I think that really does say it, right? That desire doesn't desire isn't um, coagulated through the through a generative process, through the father-son problem, and that it is to say that anything that would be produced is through desire, right? So it's kind of like it's just like the familial not being the determinant of the social. It's kind
Mhm.
of the similar move.
All right, I'll let Jean-Claire type, and then I'll continue to the third unavoidable conclusion, which is I think the one that is more important. These are a little easier. It's I think a little bit more. I almost want to say commonsensical, which is not a thing you can often say in Deleuze's work. So we'll see. See, Jean-Claire's just grabbing them good bits from the book and posting them. Love that shit. The part that Jack was just talking about. Love it. All right, to continue to the third. Finally, the point of view of the community, which is disjunctive or takes account of the disjunctions in the cycle. Not only is generation second in relation to the cycle, but transmission is second in relation to an information or a communication. A genetic revolution occurred when it was discovered that, strictly speaking, there is no transmission of flows, but a communication of a code or an axiomatic of a combinative apparatus informing the flows. Such is also the case for the social field. Its coding or its axiomatic first determine within it a communication of unconsciouses. This phenomenon of communication, which Freud touched on only marginally in his remarks on occultism, constitutes in fact the norm and pushes into the background the problems of hereditary transmission that animated the Freud-Jung controversy. It appears that in the common social field, the first thing that the son represses, or has to repress, or tries to repress, is the unconscious of the father and the mother. The failure of that repression is the basis of neuroses. But this communication of unconsciouses does not by any means take the family as its principle. It takes as its principle the commonality of the social field insofar as it is the object of an investment of desire. In all respects, the family is never determining, but is always determined, first as a stimulus of departure, then as an aggregate of destination, and finally as an intermediary or an interception of communication. The first thing a child needs to repress is his parents' unconsciouses, which I really like that line, and I think I personally, it groks me real quick. It flows. I get it. As a parent, it's very clear as a thing that is something you experience and get to watch your kid go through. I have my wife and I, we all have our own bullshit. My wife and I laugh about it. Everyone's got their thing. None of us are like perfectly healthy little wonderful creatures. And you do your best to not bring those things or visit them upon your kid, but they're going to. My parents visited last week. Those things there's stories there, there's backgrounds there, there's all kinds of things that his first job is to actually do his best to try to remove what remains of mom and dad as he grows up and he starts to sort of form his own subjectivity. Failure of repression of that is the basis for neuroses. But this communication of unconsciousness from parents to child does not take the family as its principle. It doesn't give a shit about family. It takes as its principle the commonality of the social field insofar as it is the object of investment of desire. My son goes with us when we go shopping at Safeway, or when I go to Costco, or when I'm walking around the lake, or when I'm going to go fishing, or when my wife goes out to go to the tailor to get something fixed. It's the nature of these things. He's with us when that happens. It doesn't take the family as its principle, but instead our relation as almost a single unit to society. The family is not determining of the social field, but determined by it, first as the stimulus of departure, then as the aggregate of its destination, which is a crazy sentence. I almost want to break down this last line itself. But ultimately, as an intermediary or an interception of this communication. That's a wild set of sentences that has some pretty far-reaching implications. I'll leave it open. I just really loved and personally attached to that. I know you guys love hearing about me talk about being a parent and how fucking weird it is.
Does anybody,
Mothers and dads. Go ahead.
can anybody elaborate on that Freud and Jung controversy? That sounds like related to the footnote here with Spinoza's unconscious posed by Spinoza, and then related to Myers, James, Balling, and Bergson.
I think it has to do with God damn it. It's been a long time since we looked this up, and we don't have Ken here, which I kind of feel like I don't want to super get into it without our Jungian friend. I think it has to do with archetypes and how they're handled, if I remember right the last time around. I don't think we need to nail Ken that many times. He's not going to join us. It's okay. But I think it has to do with the archetypes and how they move. It's the line here, the phenomenon of communication, which Freud touched into only marginally in his remarks on occultism, constitutes, in fact, the norm. The lines he's got before here that he's talking about are that it's not simply that there is no transmission of flows, the desire moving between, which is a little bit of that early Freud, desire itself, libidinal energy transferring. It's actually no, what happens is the communication of code or axiomatics, the codification of desire that moves and transmits and informs the flows as they move. This is the thing Freud touched on that animated the controversy underneath all of it, that it's about the communication of codes rather than just the transference of flows. And this communication of codes as such, as we've talked about it, again, to go back to chapter 3, almost in its entirety, but for sure the last 2 to 3 sections of that, the nature of capital as we get it is that we don't have a transfer of flows the same way we did in the primitive, or hell, even the despotic, that everything becomes deeply codified and axiomatized, and that those axiomatics exist at a social level. They are the things that determine and create the rules rather than our immanent desires, which are flows. This is the shift that we're talking about. And so this communication that is happening within the family is also codified, also applicable only within capitalism as we talk about it. Again, one of their major critiques of Freud is that he presumed that the world he lived in, this hyper bougie late 1800s world in Europe, was the determinant factor, when in reality, the family, as he was seeing it, was this thing that was being formed by the growth of capitalism as a socius, as the social order at large. That's how I'm reading this and how I've read this before. I'm open if anyone else wants to dive in. But it's specifically, I think it has to do with flows versus code for how these desires shift within people and how those codes work. I think it has to do with archetypes. I think that's the thing that they were getting at. The occult reference being my clue there, but someone else knows Freud way better than me. You're a Jungian. See it, young Claire, it's great. You and Ken, we need you people. Young Claire, Jung disagreed with the Freudian idea of the libido and the incest Oedipus triad. Jung felt there was more to the unconscious than daddy, mommy, me, which I think that flows. That they agree with it as well. But it's the line pushes into the background the problems of hereditary transmission. How do we transmit information to our children? That's the question that they're trying to answer here. How do I teach my son about the world? Well, it's not just literally the words that I say to him. There's a codification of general behavior and everything. But it's not just that I'm passing on my desires to him, which is, to go a little bit back into Freud, not wildly off from some of the shit that I've read that he wrote and some of his minions also wrote in return. I think. I just need to add that. It should be assumed that every time I finish talking, that's what I intend to finish with is, I think, yeah.
In this case, Deleuze is critical of Freud's, particularly the Oedipal complex, where he might be more agreeable with Jung's idea of the archetypes that resides in the unconscious and is not so easily co-opted into the capitalist socius, right?
I would put it to Jean Claire to answer that for me. But they quote, Jung once said, "The greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of its parents," which is a fucking great line. But two, sounds like what we're getting at here. The first thing a child must do is repress its parents' unconsciouses, the unlived life of its parents. I mean, to me, this sounds like we're driving at much of the same thing, but I'm sure there's a million things in Jung that whatever, I'm totally going off the reservation with. But I think generally they would sign that direction, yeah. When it's the last line here. Sorry, go ahead, Jack.
And I don't have... My understanding between the Freud and Jung is there's a whole slew of disagreements, right? And Oedipus is certainly one of them. But if we go back to the topic of the paragraph, right? Not only is generation second in relation to the cycle, but transmission is second in relation to an information or a communication, right? So the transmission, I think, being the key word here if we're talking about disjunctive synthesis. The use of memory and the functionality that machines are going to be doing, right, to produce that surplus value. I think that's the stakes here. But it's not a transmission of flows per se, it's a communication of a code or an axiomatic, depending on the socius, of a combinative apparatus informing the flows, right? So the combinative apparatus, am I right? I mean, we're basically talking about the first synthesis here and the use of the socius. If I read this into the Freud-Jung controversy, it sounds to me like, yeah, on one hand, it's probably got something to do with Oedipus. But on the other hand, it's a question of how do the unconsciouses communicate, right? Especially in psychoanalysis, where, it is kind of like and they start out with this problem, right? It's either the person's unconscious or like a collective unconscious in like a social sense, right? You kind of have this either or problem between the two, just like you would have the either or problem of, well, is it natural or is it social, right? Um, and I think the move they're making here is to say that, and I'm not sure exactly what Jung's idea is here because from what I've read, he's got the whole, he is going to go into culture into a little bit different way than Freud is. But I think the main thing being here that for the unconscious needs to communicate, right, or more directly, for the father and mother to have to have an unconscious production. That unconscious production at a social level, right, through the socius, particularly in capital, is working through the axiomatics, the way that figures uh, and the expressions thereby uh, work with codes, both supplanting them and disseminating information. That this is the way that communication is happening in the unconscious, and going to be actually affecting the production, right? Affecting what things do, as opposed to just like a generational passing on of things, right? That it came from my father and his father, and it'll go to my son. Um, or I guess with Jung, it's a little bit difficult to put my finger on that one. But I think that's the big move that they're saying. Freud kind of understands this, right? He knows that the unconsciouses um, have a communication process, right? But that's so marginal because it's going to be in service of this passing on of the cycle, right? That the use of memory is just this ongoing progenation of regeneration and progression. It's simply, right, it's not that the family is the determining thing, it's that the family is determined, right? So the way that the unconsciouses communicate isn't necessarily by reference of the familial, it is to say that their communicative process is actually going to be what invests the familial.
Oh, there's a lot there. I'm going to move on to the next paragraph because there's a lot to discuss in this next one for sure. If the familial investment is only a dependence or an application of the unconscious investments of the social field, and if this is just as true of the child as of the adult, if it is true that the child, through the mommy territoriality and the daddy law, already aims for the schizas and the encoded or axiomatic flows of the social field, then we must transport the essential difference to the heart of this domain. Delirium is the general matrix of every unconscious social investment. Every unconscious investment mobilizes a delirious interplay of disinvestments, of counterinvestments, of overinvestments. But we have seen in this context that there were two major types of social investment, segregative and nomadic, just as there were two poles of delirium. First, a paranoiac fascising type or pole that invests the formation of central sovereignty, overinvests it by making it the final eternal cause for all the other social forms of history, counterinvests the enclaves or the periphery, and disinvests every free figure of desire. Yes, I am your kind, and I belong to the superior race and class. And second, a schizo-revolutionary type or pole that follows lines of escape of desire, breaches the wall and causes flows to move, assembles its machines and its groups in fusion in the enclaves or at the periphery, proceeding in an inverse fashion from that of the other pole. I am not your kind. I belong eternally to the inferior race. I am a beast, a black. Good people say that we must not flee, that to escape is not good, that it isn't effective, that one must work for the reforms. But the revolutionary knows that escape is revolutionary. Withdrawal freaks, provided one sweeps away the social cover on leaving or causes a piece of the system to get lost in the shuffle. What matters is to break through the wall, even if one has to become black like John Brown. George Jackson. I may take flight, but all the while I am fleeing, I will be looking for a weapon. hell of a statement.
One thing I always loved about that reference is, at least in my edition, if you go all the way back to the notes for Introduction to Schizoanalysis to see where this occurs, it's absolutely blank. There's just 5 in an empty space. So it's a hell of a line, but good luck finding it.
Well, we'll start from the first and just make our way through, because this is a worthwhile paragraph. If the familial investment is only a dependence or an application of the unconscious investments of the social field, if this is just as true for child as adult, if it is true that the child, blah, 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 then we must transport the essential difference to the heart of this domain. This nature of these things, the dependence or application of the unconscious investments, all of these elements. If it is true that the child, through these things, aims for the schizas and encoded or axiomatic flows of the social field, that the child's doing this from birth, from first experience, we need to go to the heart of the domain and have a question around exactly how these deliriums operate. And this is the point. Delirium is the general matrix. It is the field of every unconscious social investment. It is the way it's laid out, how we place it, how we put it in relation to other items. Each of these investments mobilizes a delirious interplay of disinvestments, counterinvestments, or overinvestments. The nature of how we play into these may vary, how we play into these social investments, but it ultimately is an interplay of either disinvesting, counter, or over-investing. The thing is, through this, we can do one of two things. Either we can fascize through the paranoiac side of things. We can fight for the central sovereignty, the demand that things are what they are, making it a final eternal cause for all other social forms. This is the core thing they drive towards what fascism is. Opposing that, we can take lines of escape of desire, follow the desires, go through the walls, break them down, do what we do, sit where we sit, be where we are, assemble the machines and group fusions in the enclaves at the periphery, proceed inversely from the other pole, find where that central sovereignty is and run the other direction, through the walls like the Kool-Aid man if we have to, and be very clear, I am not your kind. I belong to the inferior race. I am less. I am nothing. I am not part of your world. Demand the other direction. This is the schizo, the revolutionary direction. And then the next set of lines is, we'll get to in a second. Any issues with my analysis or reading there on those parts? Any thoughts before we move to this last little bit, which is a hell of a statement in itself?
Before, were you making a connection between the delirium and the phantasm?
I probably shouldn't, because I don't have any idea if that's the case, but it feels, as we get through this, how the phantasm operates by bringing together, in logic of sense, sorry to jump back for those who aren't part of our logic of sense reading. In logic of sense, you go through a lot of work with Deleuze to talk about series of singularities, how we find meaning within how sense is made of any grouping of things, the series of items. The phantasm sits between series as a resonance between them. There isn't actually a direct connection between them, but we're able to almost manufacture one as we consider it, as we think of it. The phantasm emerges as a resonance between them. This feels to me that these deliriums have the same general application. They are through a series of social realities or coordinates on the social spectrum. And in between them, we're able to say things like, oh, this is the proper race, the master race, for example, or I am not that. How we're counter-investing or counter-actualizing, you might say, plays into this. It feels like there's a lot of crossover in how they play. Not necessarily am I saying that's the case, it just feels like there's some, at least, perhaps I'm creating a phantasm between these series of the phantasm and delirium, but it does feel like there's a similarity in how they operate and how they come to form.
Right. It seems like it has a lot to do with the the individual's relationship with the father, right?
With the parents in general, with everything.
Right. It's a complex, yeah.
Yeah, and it's all those series and all those elements when they're talking here about the two poles, and they have these things where they talk about, I am the superior race, I am the superior class. We're talking about a series that has denotations and significations and manifestations that play into a very specific direction. In this case, yes, Jean-Claire, it's about authority. It's about this central sovereignty, this final eternal cause, the paranoiac reaction to knowledge, to things. The other direction is the schizo-revolutionary, the counter-actualization. To me, it's a counter-actualization. It's charging the other direction as much as possible, saying things, I am not your kind, which is, on its face, saying that to someone is weird as shit. Like it's just one of those things. Saying I am a black. I won't say the N-word during the George Floyd protests. There was a group of Proud Boys. This white guy on the side of this group of black guys, and he started screaming, I am an N-word, and he was yelling it at the Proud Boys, and they didn't know what to fucking do. It was this really strange moment, and I didn't know if it was offensive or whatever, but it was just really odd because he was moving in that direction of demanding that you treat him as such. I am as such. Do what you do to me. And it's just this really strange mentality. The other direction, again, opposing that central sovereignty, opposing this final eternal cause and final form of social history, that sort of plays in a completely different place. I found it's an interesting visual for me, at least. I blew me away.
Maybe this is a question that he will get into later, but when they talk about escape in this context, what do they escape to?
Oh no, I would say that the problem is asking that question. Lines of escape are literally just escape. But Jack, feel free.
Well, yeah. Oh gosh, I looked away. I'm like Lot looking back, or Lot's wife looking back. Yeah, the thing I was going to say to your example there, Brooks, is that might actually help answer that question, right? Because the point about delirium is that you have like when they're talking about matrix, right? You have the whole bundle of counter investments and, well, let's just put it in easier terms, of breakdowns and breakthroughs like we saw in capital, right? There's the problem of the displacement of the limit and then the breaking of the limit, right? Which would be that schizophrenic, this is what they're talking about with the wall, right? The schizophrenic aspect coming into play and breaking that all down. I'm sorry, breaking through all of that, as opposed to just having a breakdown and this problem of the displacement that it keeps perpetuating. With your example, Brooks, I think what you see is an example of what they're talking about, because by doing that, right, it's not an escape in the sense of the guy just like walked away and left the fight. Not that there's never value in that, but it's escape in the sense that the use of codes there and the way that desire is being configured for the Proud Boys in that sense, right? The subjectivity of whiteness and that, but also the identification of an exclusivity, right? You either are or are not, right? In a sense, an us-them mentality, right? An exclusive disjunction is completely supplanted there because now there's an investment being made now. Because with the unconscious, whenever there's an investment made, it's reflexive. As the investment is being made, it's also recorded and affects the way that future investments will be made. That's like 1.2 and all of that, right? So by doing that, what that fellow is actually doing is it's more or less forcing a reconfiguration, right? Breaking through a certain wall of not just codes, but actually axiomatics, right? Of subjectivities and causing a reconfiguration. Now, you don't get that purity though, because it's like when we were talking about Wall Street bets, right? Maybe there was something revolutionary in what happened with the way that all of a sudden we saw hedge fund managers pleading that they couldn't afford these giant bills and that they had been swindled and then robbed and this was unjust and all of that bourgeois. and the whole meme stock thing. But now that all plays into it, right? So and that's the matrix, that it just these events keep happening, and the investments stay with them. So that the escape is matricized in that manner, right? It's a line that allows for this new flow to take place, like the pipe bursting, right? It's sort of more or less that kind of escape, as opposed to like just running away in
Well,
like a more traditional sense.
they phrase it very specifically at the end there that I love is the line, "What matters is to break through the wall." That's to the question asked by Misha, where are you escaping to? That's not the point. The point is to break through the wall. The line they have, even if one has to become black like John Brown. And that's a phenomenal statement. John Brown's body is a moldering in the ground. Great hero of the Civil War. Well, great abolitionist hero. John Brown was not black um, by any measurement of his skin. It was a religious fervor. Killed a whole bunch of slave owners. Good dude. But the line is that we have to maybe become black like John Brown to take on these elements that, again, no one is any race. That's silliness. But these things have secondary social investments, overinvestments, disinvestments, and counterinvestments to Tiernan's questions. So if you want to talk about what overinvestment is, it's, I'm going to overinvest in race and its importance. I am part of the master race. I am white. It's wonderful. God damn it. I'm going to get clipped. Counterinvesting. Oh no, I'm black. I'm black. I'm not like you. I'm eternally inferior. And then a disinvestment is simply the disinvesting, not getting involved, which tends to be a play, you could argue, for some level of investment. But that's the push, is that within everything in the social field, we're always doing something that is one of those things. Like we're always investing, overinvesting, counterinvesting, disinvesting through everything. They go through it as their examples. The paranoiac fascising type pole invests in the formation of central sovereignty first. It's a power station. Overinvests by making this form the final eternal cause from all other social forms of history. America is the greatest country that ever will exist. It's not hard, by the way, as an American, to come up with good examples of the garbage here. Counterinvest, the enclaves or the periphery. Jesus Christ, I don't want to give depressing examples, but find things at the peripheral of the power structure in white America. It's not hard to find where they counterinvest. Black towns in Alabama that haven't had running water or have an open air sewage system. These are the things that they counterinvest as a setup. And they disinvest free figures of desire. The free figure of desire here that is completely just sort of left by the wayside. They're able to say things as such. They come out and say, I am your kind. I belong to the superior racing class. I'm part of you. The incredibly poor Trump voter who has nothing in common with anyone who's wealthy, voting for tax breaks for billionaires. The Elon Musk fan. This is their investment and where it comes from, and they're fascising on that side of the pole and how their investments work.
And so is that so-called breaking of the wall an alternative to any kind of investment, or is it also an investment? Sorry, that's where I'm a little bit confused.
You're still investing.
Okay.
Yeah, it's just an inverse fashion from the other pole. That's their point here. It's a question of what everything is. Everything we deal with socially, we're investing in something, counterinvesting, disinvesting. What we are, or our subjectivity, or our relations socially, are these different levels of investment in all kinds of things and deliriums socially. The question is, what are you invested in? That's the question. And not in terms of, I really love this liberal type, no, I back equality or shit like that. No. Where are you investing? What stories are you telling? What is your delirium? that is being told through what your investments are. To them, they say the lines of escape would be proceeding in an inverse fashion. Breaches the wall, causes flows to move. It's very much overinvests almost every figure of desire. It's the opposing reality. I am not your kind. I belong to, specifically, I belong eternally to the inferior race. It's not, oh, today I'm black because whatever. It's I'm eternally the inferior race because I refuse to be part of that power structure. It's counter investing in that central sovereignty, in that authority. There's very specific words they have around all of this. I'm not sure I'm a cool fan of how they phrase "I am a beast, a black," but I think they're making some points in reference to a few other texts there. It's just awkwardness.
Yeah, it's Rimbaud.
What?
Yeah, it's from Rimbaud.
Oh,
It's a French poet, Arthur Rimbaud.
oh, that would make sense then, because isn't
Yeah, you
Rimbaud
don't put in
also
quotes.
who is, yeah, they should put in quotes. Rimbaud is actually who they reference in Capitalism, a special type of delirium, a very special delirium. Rimbaud is who they actually reference pretty directly a couple times. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, and it kind of goes back to your example, right? I mean, we can talk about poetry and all that, but at just a basic level, he's basically forcing the audience in a sense to reconsider things on a whole different set of terms, right? And he's able to kind of provide those terms, in a sense, like the kind of counter investing in that they're talking about, right? It is this kind of schizophrenic thing in that, but it's, like this aspect of I am a beast, I am a black, right? There's a way in which certain things are affirmed, and in a sense, like the negative is basically inverted too, right? Because like in your example of Alabama and that, something like a black town and that, I mean, it's still there, right? But it can be defined in terms of what it's not, which is the white town. But there's a way in which, through an affirmative process, I think what they're getting at is um, the affirmation of something like blackness and that quality. It's not to simply identify as being black on that, right? This gets into a problem of particularly over-investing, right? Just like over-coding, where now you're just kind of putting blocks of signifieds on top of each other. What you instead get is something like that functionality being redistributed um, in a manner unlike the exclusivity of it, right? Where instead of it just being an either or problem in that, either white or black in terms of the distribution, you end up getting that inclusive disjunction where a new subjectivity altogether is being produced, a new configuration is made possible through this particular schizophrenic use because the wall has been broken through, right? Desire is now flowing and connecting in different ways, um, with and now on its own terms, right? But also with having passed beyond that absolute limit we were talking about, that is actually supplanted in a certain sense.
The last thing to mention is it's worth reading Deleuze's letters. He did a bit with Claire Parnett. But anytime he mentions Lines of Flight and George Jackson, it's very specifically in reference to the black radical George Jackson, who died in a prison riot when he took hostages. And actually, he wrote some pretty fantastic bits. There's a book called Letters of George Jackson. I think it's called Letters, Journals of, God damn it, what's it called? Something from George Jackson that very much Deleuze was very taken by. And it's pretty formative, especially to this, but also his future writings. It's worth looking at. Doubtless, there are astonishing oscillations of the unconscious, from one pole of delirium to the other, the way in which an expected revolutionary force breaks free, sometimes even in the midst of the worst archaisms. Inversely, the way in which everything turns fascist or envelops itself in fascism, the way in which it falls back into archaisms. 1 second, my monitor just went out. All right. Or, staying on the level of literary examples, the case of Celine, the great victim of delirium, who evolves while communicating more and more with the paranoia of his father. The case of Jack Kerouac, the artist possessing the soberest of means, who took revolutionary flight, but who later finds himself immersed in dreams of a great America, and then in search of his Breton ancestors of the superior race. Isn't the destiny of American literature that of crossing limits and frontiers, causing deterritorialized flows of desire to circulate, but also always making these flows transport fascising, molarizing, Puritan, and familialist territorialities? The answer to that question is yes.
Oh man, but Walt Whitman, bro.
I mean, it's Deleuze was deeply taken with most American literature and poetry in a way that he wasn't with almost any other culture. But for sure, his example of Kerouac is spot on. And it's a very consistent thing you tend to see in American writing, American lit, that there's an overtime that happens, and there's a fascising, a molarizing, a puritanal and familialist sort of recovery of whatever went beyond that, which is pretty powerful to say. It's a great sentence. This is, again, getting at one of the things that I really like this as a concept and a way to sort of talk through this. The idea that there is only one direction and that we're only ever, the good person moves this direction or is always revolutionary or does this, or if a person makes a turn. There's oscillations of the unconscious, one pole of delirium to the other. And it's astonishing, his wording. It's amazing how you can slam from one way to the other. Earlier they talk at length about the tragedy that was the Soviet Union and why it ultimately ended up in fascism. It's not the only time that that's happened, where far left movements have ended up being as right, if not further right, than most any that have existed. People who've started out deeply, deeply left wing have made their way slowly over to other placements. The oscillation of the unconscious from one delirium to another is a really nice way of putting it. Oof.
Well, it shows the matrix so nicely, right? That you have the problem of the revolutionary and the reactionary, right? That you can't have like just a pure revolutionary path, or just like you make a revolutionary investment, you're done. The example I always like is, and if Richard Wolff ever listens to this, I hope you direct all comments to the hot takes of G. Deleuze. Any criticisms or vituperances, be sure to put them there. But the idea of the worker co-op, that there could have been this revolutionary investment being made in these workplaces and that, right? But there is arguably some problem there in terms of taking that as kind of the answer to all of this, or that by simply moving into the structure, everything will be fine, right? That having that kind of identity, creating this kind of potentially having this kind of exclusive disjunction on that there's something actually producing the interest in worker co-ops, which to me, you could even walk in the archaism that, right? Credit unions and that have existed for hundreds of years. And I think that is kind of the point, that you get these movements across the limits that create these breakthroughs, these whole new configurations and reconfigurations, right? Where sexuality is creating new things, right? The generative process is happening. And at the same time, you also encounter the reactionary investments, where you have the reproduction becoming a problem as well, that is actually being counter-invested as well.
The way that they talk about it, they have on one side Kerouac, who begins from that and then moves his way into fascism. But I like the other, which is the person who within the hyper-fascistic or the worst archaisms finds a way to sort of break free. A simple example of that would be Freud with his push towards the idea of libidinal energy being underlying. That there are shifts that can happen even in the worst archaisms, these odd forces that break free. It's a really fantastic way to sort of think through that. Simple paragraph. If anyone has any comments in general, Jean-Claire, I agree. Kerouac, stunningly beautiful writing that ultimately does lead nowhere. Hunter S. Thompson would be on that list for me too. Fantastically interesting, and then holy shit, wait, what?
You like Hunter S. Thompson?
I like his
man.
early stuff for sure.
All right, on.
We've talked about this.
No, we haven't. I didn't know you were interested in it. That's cool. We
Burroughs.
have something in
Burroughs is
common.
fantastic. Burroughs is fantastic. There's a lot. It's, if we want to talk about the American way, it's to do things different than the previous generation until you are in power, and then make sure you harden things as tightly as possible and become a fascist. That's what my father's father did. That's what my father did before me.
Yeah, the American dream.
Yep.
Do
As long
it
as I get
differently and then
mine.
make that the standard.
Yeah, as long as I get mine.
Yep. So that's what it was.
Yeah, so that's what it was. All right, next paragraph. I'll let Nomadic finish writing, and I'll see if it's anything. Johnny Depp shot his ashes into space.
Yeah, Thompson's, yeah.
Johnny Depp's
I don't think it
fascinating.
went to outer space, though.
No, Lord British from Ultima Online, Richard Garriott, got to take his father's ashes into space.
Obviously, he went further than Johnny Depp ever could.
He actually went into space. I think he was the first, people are wild.
I don't think Thompson left the ozone, yeah.
All right, let's move on. We'll do it. These oscillations of the unconscious, these underground passages from one type of libidinal investment to the other, often the coexistence of the two, form one of the major objects of schizoanalysis. The two poles united by Artaud in the formula, Heliogabalus the anarchist, quote, the image of all human contradictions and the contradiction in principle. But no passage impairs or suppresses the difference in nature between the two, nomadism and segregation. If we are able to define this difference as that which separates paranoia and schizophrenia, it is because, on the one hand, we have distinguished the schizophrenic process, the breakthrough, from the accidents and relapses that hinder or interrupt it, the breakdown. And because, on the other hand, we have posited paranoia no less than schizophrenia as independent of all familial pseudo-etiologies, so as to make them bear directly upon the social field, every name in history and not the name of the father. On the contrary, the nature of the familial investments depends on the breaks and the flows of the social field as they are invested in one type or another at one pole or the other. And the child does not wait until he is an adult before grasping, underneath father-mother, the economic, financial, social, and cultural problems that cross through a family. His belonging or his desire to belong to a superior or an inferior race, the reactionary or the revolutionary tenor of the familial group with which he is already preparing his ruptures and his conformities. Another great, see, it's my favorite part. Some of these paragraphs are just so crisp.
Well, the Heliogabalus image from Artaud is spot on, right? On
Yes.
one hand, yeah, absolutely breakthrough after breakthrough. On the other hand, absolutely breakdown with breakdown.
Yep. Well, and that's again, to get to it, the relapses that hinder or interrupt the process, to keep going back. And it's one of the things that makes it fascinating is to talk about all of this as a process, not a thing. No one is a revolutionary. They're becoming revolutionary or becoming paranoiac. They're moving their way through it because of how they've set these elements up. They've set these things up independent of familial pseudo-etiologies to make them bear directly on the social field. The last line here, I just love that the child immediately understands the investments of the parents. It immediately grasps them. It's silly to assume otherwise. They're able to know where the parents think the good stuff is and where's the bad stuff, what angers them, what upsets them. these things that flow through the family, these codified realities that parents deal with, the child, through the mother father, for sure, still gains all of that. Dexter knows I hate Walmart, but we go when we don't have money. It's like, I can't hide that shit from him. I'm a emotive person, but even that, the average parent is just that. You just are dealing with what you're dealing with, and the kids absorb it.
Yeah, right, because the unconscious is, so I mean, there's a plurality there, but the unconscious in its auto production is communicative, right? That's the whole point about like the signifying chains and that from the first synthesis. So just like
Yes.
you're saying, right? Going to Walmart with your kid and all that, I mean, and I think that is the states what they're getting at, to repress the parents and in quotes, unconscious is basically what they're saying is the repression of the social field, right? That which would make the familial possible and that which determines it, right? That would be the thing to be repressed there. And I agree with you. I don't know how you, I don't know how you do that except through maybe like what they're doing here, right? A kind of like familialism.
Well, and that's the line Jean Claire pulls out, because the kid already is forming his ruptures and his conformities. Like, already the kid is figuring out where it should break from or where it should fall in line. And that shift and that change is something that begins immediately and is absolutely just clear. If you've ever been around children, around their parents, do it for long enough, you can see exactly, like, the kid, Dexter loves Pikachu. I grew up playing Pokemon. I love Pokemon. I don't give a shit. I've got my commercial side. I don't care. Love Pokemon. Love Pikachu. He likes the same ones I like. And it's not that I said this is the best. It's that I got excited when he wanted to buy Pikachu versus getting excited when he wanted to buy Charmander. That's just, am I supposed to be flat to like, it's a shitty example, but like, I just imagine if I was a racist, like the way people are reacting to Tucker Carlson on TV or specific significations around those things, the kid's already falling in line. The kid's already figuring out what he's doing against. The economic, financial, social, and cultural problems that cross through the family are already seen. His belonging or his desire to belong to a superior or inferior race, the reactionary or revolutionary tenor of the familial group with which he's already preparing his ruptures and his conformities, is laying this out in place. And this is that sort of underlying thing behind all of it. It's he cares more about Charmander right now, if you care about that, Misha.
That's because he hasn't discovered Squirtle.
No, he doesn't care about Squirtle. Sorry, no one does.
Oh, you bastard!
But
first you give me Thompson, now you take away Squirtle.
Well, and again, when we talk, but here's the thing: this investment in the social field, he's learning from me, and he's learning from my wife, and he's learning from not really anyone else, aside from it being COVID time and that being the nature of it. Everything's coming through our familial unit. Things that affect the neighbors, things that affect our town, he feels less just by nature of that beast. But the things that affect our family, he feels strongly. It imprints upon him. It'll imprint upon my daughter that's coming. These things happen, and it's set upon us as our investments within the social field that get passed on. And his job is effectively to find ways to repress the parents or remove them entirely. But as he's going, he's already grasping. This is already set up. He's already set up for all of these things. And it's the two poles as they lay out. I want to get to the next paragraph because it's a great one. And I'm going to read straight through, actually a little bit longer. So prepare. What a muddle, what an emulsion the family is, agitated by backwashes, pulled in one direction or another, in such a way that the Oedipal bacillus takes or doesn't take, imposes its mold or doesn't succeed in imposing it, pursuing directions of an entirely different nature that traverse the family from the exterior. What we mean is that Oedipus is born of an application or a reduction to personalized images, which presupposes a social investment of a paranoiac type, which explains why Freud first discovers the familial romance in Oedipus while reflecting on paranoia. Oedipus is a dependency of the paranoiac territoriality, whereas the schizophrenic investment commands an entirely different determination. A family gasping for breath and stretched out over the dimensions of the social field, it does not reclose or withdraw. A family as matrix for depersonalized partial objects, which plunge again and again into the torrential or depleted flux of a historic cosmos, a historic chaos. The matrical fissure of schizophrenia, as opposed to paranoiac castration, and the line of escape, as opposed to the blue line, the blues. O mother, farewell, with a long black shoe of farewell, with Communist Party and a broken stocking, with your sagging belly, with your fear of Hitler, with your mouth of bad short stories, with your belly of strikes and smokestacks, with your chin of Trotsky and the Spanish War, with your voice singing for the decaying, overbroken workers, with your eyes of Russia, with your eyes of no money, with your eyes of starving India, with your eyes of Czechoslovakia attacked by robots, with your eyes being led away by policemen to an ambulance, with your eyes with the pancreas removed, with your eyes of appendix operation, with your eyes of abortion, with your eyes of ovaries removed, with your eyes of shock, your eyes of lobotomy, your eyes of divorce. It's Allen Ginsberg, by the way, the Kaddish, worth reading. Why these words, paranoia and schizophrenia, which are like talking
So
birds?
that is a new paragraph.
Of course it is. We'll stop there then.
Not to interrupt you, I appreciated that.
No, it's good to interrupt because the next one is, I think, a full page. So anyway, his poem, Allen Ginsberg's poem, Kaddish, the Kaddish is, I believe, but he's saying goodbye to his mother, who was very ill and in a mental institution, and through his youth, this happened. This was kind of what he grew up with, and her reality that she was seeing, that she would talk about, was not. It was that of the Communist Party, her fear of Hitler, Trotsky and the Spanish War that she was involved in, which she wasn't. And then the ending here with your eyes of Russia, no money, starving India, Czechoslovakia attacked by robots. These things that she talked of and spoke of. The poem's very emotional and difficult, but the lines here are incredible towards very much what we're talking about, how this muddling emulsion of the family comes to communicate to the child things and what he sees and what they learn and how they set up. With, on the one hand, the family demanding behavior, the paranoiac territoriality with the opposing, stretching out everything. A family as matrix for depersonalized partial objects, which is what Ginsberg effectively experienced a great deal in his writing about Inside of the Kaddish. Things are whatever they need to be in that time as they move, and it's a really beautiful poem. I highly recommend. We did a reading of it long ago, but I highly recommend it. It's incredible. I leave it open.
And you can see the assemblages of desire here, right? The part I attached to, what we mean is that Oedipus is born of an application or a reduction to personalized images, which presupposes a social investment of a paranoiac type, which explains why Freud first discovers the familiar romance in Oedipus while reflecting on paranoia. Right, the application of these images and that there's a paranoiac territoriality. And certainly you can talk about that in relation to the Kaddish and that. But I think you can also talk about it in terms of like, right, the syntheses and that, where the eyes, right, just at the level of the second synthesis, the functionality of the eyes in relation to a flow of desire with Russia, that the eyes are able to see this, that they're doing these kind of Russian things, if you like, but also going to Czechoslovakia, also going to the Spanish War, right? Now we're in the US kind of thing. Um, the different things, the different capacities that the eyes are using here in terms of desire and that, as opposed to like the familial image of the forlorn, taboo, off limits mother.
I have a question about the last sentence of page 278 when
Please.
they talk about the line escape as opposed to the blue line, because I could only think of the of the Blue Lives Matter flag, unfortunately, but I don't really get the reference of blue line for the blues.
Do you have it?
No, go
I know
for it.
it's. So we had someone on who explained to us it's this reference that everybody in France gets. And unfortunately, I don't have a great answer for you here because I don't remember what that.
Oh, I do. I actually,
Blue. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I get
actually
it.
know this.
Does.
It's
So-
a national color.
The Vosges Mountains in France are often referred to as the blue line. They're the edge of the state. They are the hardened line. So the line that they have here, the metrical fissure of schizoanoia, as opposed to the paranoiac castration, a line of escape, as opposed to the blue line, the line that marks the edge of the state, which is, by the way, back to that sovereignty and authoritarian state. So that's the reference that they're making.
It makes 100% sense, and I find it really funny how that rhymes with current day America.
Oh, dude.
I mean, the blue line of the state. How more literal can it get?
The fact when you posted thin blue line, I was like, that's not the reference, but that's the reference now. So it's like, I guess it works now. Like it's welcome 50 years later, nothing changes. Yay. I'm going to post a link to it because it's a thing. We had someone who actually lived in France, like, oh, that's what that was. I'm like, oh shit. Okay. That actually, because they mentioned it a few times also in, Deleuze uses it as an allegory a lot, in a lot of different things. So it's a thing worth knowing if you're reading up, because he just says blue line and it doesn't mean literally a blue line. Also, it doesn't make sense that they call it blue line, but I don't really care.
Because I think it was like Terrence or somebody was trying to say, like, they were suggesting that that's why the translators put in the blues there. They were trying to make a point that Americans might be able to understand. I think it felt pretty flat, but
super flat. So, and because there's a lot of color behind this, as the link says, the Alsace-Lorraine region separated the Vosges from that area. So it happened specifically along the Franco-German border prior to World War I. And so it's the reference here very specifically is the historicity of where our land used to be. So we're talking hyper paranoiac. Like this is like wild. This isn't just the liberal, oh no, I believe in the state. This is someone saying, hey, that's where France is actually supposed to fucking be, if not for those fucking Germans who took our land from us. That's what's being said here. That's what the paranoiac here is referring to when they say the blue line. The line of escape would be the opposite of that.
So interesting. I've known about that area my whole life, but never thought about it like that, and I think that's really interesting. But also, blue is just also the national color of France, so it's the thing that you refer to if you're proud of your country. You're proud of the blues.
Oh, well then maybe that's what the blues means. I've never heard someone say that about France, the blues, really?
Well, I mean, in French, if you're chanting for your sports team, you say "Go Blues," like you say "Allez les Bleus."
Why?
Because they wear blue shirts. That's their national color. For example, in the Netherlands, our national color is orange.
well, I got to tell you, Misha, if you're explaining soccer to Americans, this is a bad idea.
Okay.
Blue has been used in the heraldry of the French monarchy since the 12th century. Oh, the fleur de lis.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so it's the national color, like from the dynasty.
Now that you're saying this, now that you're saying this, because it's really common when you talk about like gourmet French tea or elements, is they add the blue cornflowers in as one of the like symbols of it. Like blue being this underlying. All right, I'm so
Yeah,
that makes more sense because again, now we're talking about, to say the whole sentence, the line of escape as opposed to the blue line, the blues. This, which again is that hyper nationalistic, paranoiac reaction. So that flows too. Thank you, Misha. Interesting.
yeah, and it's also interesting that the blue color stayed even after France famously got rid of their monarchy. The blue stayed. I mean, sorry, people know about the French Revolution, right?
Interesting. No, I've never heard of it.
Okay.
That's when they went from blue to red, right?
Well, with
That's a joke.
you know
That was
what?
a joke. That was a joke,
Yeah.
Misha. That was a joke.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because you had in the French Revolution you have the red and the blues, right? Those are two parties in the revolution, but well, sorry, never mind. But also, blood is red. Well, okay, sorry. But Napoleon also wore blue, right?
You can't explain my joke, man. It makes it
Okay,
worse
sorry,
than it already
sorry.
is.
I'm not. We're gonna. So at that moment, we are now gonna pull back. We are going to end our reading today because we're about halfway through, and I think it's worth us taking the time next week. Same Oedipal time, same Oedipal channel. We will talk through the rest of this section. This has been a wonderful reading. Thank all of you for joining very much. I look forward to next week, where we'll be continuing from the end of the Kaddish, which again, go read. There's some wonderful readings on YouTube. Thank all of you for joining. Bye-bye.